is when she looks at definitions in the dictionary and it doesn't meet with her data, and all of the research that she's done. She reworks the definition. So she reworked a definition of perfectionism, and I'll just read it for you because she does a really good job of just succinctly putting it in wonderful terms. So perfectionism is the self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels the thought, if I look perfect, live perfectly, work perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. So there's a lot to unpack there. I guess that's what we're here to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that sums it up for me and actually really weaves in nicely with the work that I do with people every day. As an AEDP therapist, we look very closely at the feelings that we try to avoid, right?
Yeah, when we're in pain, all the things we do to not be in pain, emotional
Absolutely.
pain,
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So even with that recognition, right, I have so much compassion when perfectionism shows up in my office. So something that I really really like to work with people, and it shows up so frequently.
Yeah. Do you think perfectionism is like a mental health issue?
Um, that's a good question. I think it can be, in terms of like getting in the way of us being able to go about our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
It can certainly contribute to feelings of low mood and
Right.
and anxiety. Absolutely. So I don't know that I would label it a mental health,
Right.
but it certainly can be connected. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the one thing that I've really learned working with adults with ADHD is that everything is okay until it makes us not functional.
Yes.
So
Yes.
focusing on like the functionality, like where is this thing showing up in your life that's tying your shoelaces together, and
Absolutely.
you can't do the things you want to do and live the life you want to live and feel the way you want to feel because you're using these coping mechanisms that might have made sense at some point along the way in your life.
Yeah.
And now as an adult, it's not serving you. And then,
Absolutely.
as you said, unpacking and untangling this like giant ball of yarn, sometimes it feels like, is to, holy geez, how do we get here? And then
Yeah.
how do I work my way back to a place of a little bit more freedom, connecting to myself, to your
Yes.
point with the
Yeah.
AEDP lens. And when you're a late diagnosed adult in particular, and
Mhm.
you've spent your whole life kind of receiving messages, whether they're explicit or implicit, that you're not measuring up, that you're
Mhm.
not meeting the expectation. Oh, we know you can do better. Just, you got to
Mhm.
apply yourself. Or she's got so much potential. Or if only she would XYZ, she could
Yeah.
be, ABC. And these messages start to create this inner dialogue
Yeah.
that there's something else I gotta be doing, and I don't know what it is. No one's really telling me, but it's something. And so then you're on this constant search to improve, I'm making air quotes,
Mhm. Absolutely.
improve
Yeah.
some vague abstract thing in your life that, geez, once you get there, everything's gonna be fine.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it just keeps that, um, that goal, right? It just keeps
Right.
moving, right? We never seem to really reach the top, right? We
Mhm.
think, oh, once we get here, we're going to be
Mhm.
okay. Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm completely agreeing with everything that you're saying, and it really, spoke to me when you talked about, that how it just kind of, it's just takes over, right? It takes
Mhm.
over and makes it really difficult to do the day-to-day tasks.
Yeah,
And
it becomes
absolutely.
consuming. And then we're
Totally.
triggered by whatever we're triggered by. And
Yeah.
so then it just becomes a way of living. Like we wake up and every day it's this relentless pursuit to somehow be better than the day before without ever kind of wondering, like, why are we doing that? Like, and what does it
Yeah.
mean? Like, is this what our life is? Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting when I work with people it's often something that I see, but they don't necessarily see.
Yeah.
I don't
Because
know
we
if you
can see
find that.
people's pain, 100%. So when you can bear witness and you slow down, and we have this ability to see how much
Mhm.
harder things are than they need to be, and kind of try and really understand with someone what their experience of that is,
Yeah,
then I mean, it's when you reflect that back, what you see, it can be quite powerful.
absolutely. Yeah, totally.
Because I guess by definition, when we're trying to protect ourselves, it's this instinctive, automatic,
Mhm.
involuntary nervous
Mhm.
system thing that's happening
Mhm.
that by definition doesn't really include higher thinking.
Yeah, that's not cognitive, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think what often happens, or what often people believe about perfectionism, is that it means being perfect. So I often get that, oh no, I'm not, I don't, I that's not me. I don't have perfectionism at
Yeah.
all, because I'm nowhere near perfect.
Right.
And when I kind of say, well, it's more about that fear of failing,
Yeah.
right? That needing to strive,
Driving.
and that worry about what other people think,
Yeah.
right? I think that's when they start to go, oh, yeah, or I know that's what they do. That's
Yep.
when they say, okay, yeah, maybe this is something that I need to look a little closer at.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I think one other thing I kind of thought about, when you're an adult with ADHD, or I'd say even a teenager with ADHD, there's this kind of feeling like, oh well, if I'm not supposed to be perfectionistic, that means I'm going to take my foot off the gas pedal.
Mhm.
And then there's this fear of like, I was only keeping my head above water as it was. So if people are telling me I shouldn't, be pushing myself that way, then I take my foot off the gas, then I'll be even less productive than I was before.
Right.
And it's like the iceberg, or Fred Flintstone. I'm
Yeah,
dating myself now, with like his
yeah, yeah,
little
yeah.
feet
Well,
running.
I
There's
do.
no
I
engine, and it's like
do.
all this like, energy to just keep up, but nobody else can see on the outside what's going on the inside, and it's
Yeah.
exhausting.
Yeah. Again, that's where like I have, so much compassion for them. And I think, a big part of what I do and the work that I do, is helping them, recognize that too, right? And if they can see it from me first, it's often this recognition, right? There's often a lot of emotion when I say, oh my gosh, I feel, I can see how difficult this is for you, and just relate to them in that way. That's when we can see emotion, and they can recognize, oh my gosh, yeah, this is something that's really
Yeah.
bugging me. Hmm.
Is there like a particular like way you approach, so you've identified perfectionism with somebody, which you can have outside of ADHD. I mean, to be clear for everybody listening, I mean, it just happens to be an association in my world that way, but it doesn't.
It makes a lot of sense. So yeah, the way that you
Yeah.
describe that, because ADHD isn't something that I specialize. It's certainly something
Right.
that I see,
Mhm.
and you've helped me recognize that in many clients.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's something that, I can definitely see the way that you're making those connections. And again, just that
Mhm.
my compassion goes out to people that are, yeah,
Mhm.
the shoelaces, tied together was, an interesting analogy, and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's I don't know, like, I kinda think about this, and I'm pretty quick to say I don't think I'm a perfectionist, because I'm not super 100% vested in other people's perception of what I'm doing, as long as I know I'm okay with it. But I
Right.
think I've come to that not from some great Zen place. I've come to that from probably being hurt a lot in the past, and recognizing quite painfully that I can't focus on that as an outcome, right? And I'm
Yeah.
okay to let things go. I'm okay to be more realistic about what's the amount of effort I should put into something based on what I hope to get out of it, and focusing on the journey part rather than the outcome. But that being said, I don't know. I'm drawn to exploring it more, because
Mhm.
in trying to apply self-compassion, it can be hard.
Mhm.
And I wonder, like, well, if that antidote is hard in my mind, I'm calling it the antidote.
Yeah.
I wonder why that is, and maybe there's more there. I mean, it's always just so interesting. So, is there a particular way that you kind of generally approach it? And I know you tailor and adapt everything you're doing, but like,
Mm.
how do you start to break perfectionism down with somebody who
Yeah.
maybe isn't convinced that it's a problem?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know that I necessarily like hone in on the label if they're not seeing it. What
Right.
what is important is they recognize that it is getting in the way, or that there is some shame here that's driving it, right? Brene again talks, I bring up her often, right?
Yeah.
Your body of work, but she talks about perfectionism being a shield of protection,
Yep.
right? But it's very much, if perfectionism is driving, shame is riding shotgun, and fear is in the back seat, right?
Mm,
So
great
even
enough.
if we don't focus on the perfectionism and we recognize there's shame here, right? There's some
Mm,
feelings of not good enough that are
right.
driving.
Lots
Um,
of not good enough in ADHD life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, self-compassion can be, or developing self-compassion can be something that can be really helpful for many defenses, right? Whether it be
Mm,
perfectionism or, um, yeah, having that harsh inner critic, or, so many things that get in the way that are driven by shame,
yeah.
right?
Well, and when just like you're making me think of something that's so important in the place where when we do psychotherapy and we talk about it, like adapting it for an ADHD brained person. So if
Mhm.
you're seeing a therapist that isn't ADHD trained and you've got ADHD, it doesn't mean all for naught, because this part of the important work can be done regardless of that. Because when there's lots of things to be ashamed of,
Mhm.
unpacking that and bringing light to that. I think Brene says that too, right? Where light
Mhm.
shines, their shame starts to dissipate, something along those lines.
Absolutely.
Because that's driving an emotional response. Usually it's probably avoidance,
Yeah.
doom scrolling on Twitter, all of the things we do to not feel
Numb. Yeah.
feelings.
Yeah.
And then when we do that, we're out of our body, out of our sense of ourselves and what we need to do. That actually impacts our executive function, which if it's
Mhm.
already on shaky ground, if we've got ADHD,
Yeah.
if it's the evening and there's no meds on board, or there's more stressors in our lives, so we're a little more symptomatic than usual, then we can't honor the commitments we've made to ourselves to show up for ourselves and for our family. So it's like
Right.
sometimes we talk a lot about like, oh, we've got to work on time management and stuff. And quite literally we do. But
Mhm.
before all that stuff comes is emotional self-management.
Mhm. Mhm.
And and I think emotional self-management can be really derailed by issues of shame and not good enough. And I've got to do it right, or why bother if I can't even do it at all, and
Yeah.
feeling
Yeah.
demoralized,
Yeah.
by how
Yeah.
hard things can be.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's something that I always work on with clients, is to help them see the the defenses, whether it be, perfectionism or the other ways that I mentioned that it kind of shows up. That shame kind of is this like, uh, you know, protector sort of, right?
Yeah.
Um, is helping them recognize it's, yeah, I think you said this early on too, is like it's, or maybe it was before we jumped on here.
Yeah.
Um, it's we turn to perfectionism and these other defenses as a way to protect ourselves,
Yeah.
right? And so if we
Sure.
can give compassion to that,
Yeah.
right? If they see me giving compassion to that,
Yeah.
I like to help them recognize that for themselves. And I mean, in the work that I do, we go a little bit. I love
Yeah.
your title of your therapy practice, because it's so
Literally.
important to me
Yeah.
to dig a little bit deeper, right? To find out where
Yeah.
did this start, right? And if you can have some recognition of where the shame kind of started,
Yeah.
um, then we can give a lot of compassion, and we can say things like, gosh, you needed that at one time, right?
Yeah.
Maybe things weren't so great in the household that you grew up in. And the only way that you were able to feel good enough is if brought home the A's,
Yeah.
and that
Accomplish
kind of
something.
thing. Yeah. So helping them recognize that, and then they can, you know, turn towards that
Mhm.
defense, right? And recognize, yeah, it served me, it helped me. I know, or when it shows up for them, right? The needing to be, doing everything right. to be able to turn towards it rather than get upset with it, and be able to say, I get that you're here. I know you're trying to help me, right? Maybe I don't need you so much anymore. Those
Right.
kinds of things we can work on.
Yeah. Why is self-compassion so hard?
Yeah, it is hard.
Yeah.
There's some of Kristen Neff's work is important to look at when we answer that question, right? She's done a lot of research in this area, has kind of dedicated her career to it. And there's this belief that if we're kind to ourselves, that we're not going to be motivated to do things. So that can be one of the ways that we, kind of look at self-compassion or compassion as something I don't necessarily need to do that because it's just going to make me unmotivated. It's going to make me lazy. It's
Right.
self-pity if I give myself. So
Yeah.
there's these like myths about self-compassion that I think are important to debunk.
Yeah. You know what you just totally made me think of though, in saying that is that like we can be really rigid about the coping mechanism we finally found that worked, even if it's not serving us now, right? So a lot of times people with ADHD as adults will seem like they have these rigid sets of rules about how things need to be in their lives. And on the outside, it could look a little bit like, they could be a bit obsessive or, compulsive about certain things, but it's not that. It's actually that if they don't, set something up a certain way because it's happened in the past that they forget because of their spotty working memory or their executive function deficits that hadn't been really identified yet as such, that things will fall apart. So then they become really rigid about that. Sure. And then, you get married and have kids, and then you inflict your rigid standards on everybody else, thinking that, well, this is how I've become adulting and getting things done. Therefore, this must be what other people need to do, without recognizing that, oh, wait a minute, like maybe we need to examine actually how that all started in the first place. And I wonder if the fear of self-compassion can be a little bit hard because that asks you to challenge the rigid beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's true. And I think, in psychotherapy, we can do even some experiential work with that, right? In terms of what does it feel like when I give you some compassion, right?
Oh,
It.
For those of you listening, Mindy will do that sometimes when we're in a peer supervision or a consultation together. And I'm just like, oh, she got me.
And then if you can hone in on what that does inside of you, right? And you can recognize the warmth that's there, whatever it feels like inside, you can start to recognize, okay, maybe there's something to this, right? Maybe it is okay if I give myself some kindness.
Yeah. Like the warmth, I do have warmth rising up in my chest. Like even as you just said that, not even directly to me, but describing it to me. So it's that powerful. And then, when that happens, then my nervous system's regulating and I'm getting calmer and feeling more safe.
Yeah.
And then my higher thinking can come back on. So in effect, having some self-compassion does actually fuel my executive function and allow me to do the things I need to do to take care of myself so that I can show up in my life tomorrow morning when I wake up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, but it is common for people to not let self-compassion be something that they want to buy into, right? It is a common thing to like a defense again, right? To work with in therapy for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there like any specific activities you do? Like, if any of people that I've worked with before listening in, they might recognize Mindy's voice, because one thing that I do, Mindy, is, and I do this, but I share your self-compassion meditation, and I often have assigned it as homework. Yeah. And kind of, I like, of course, in adapting, I like to figure out exactly with somebody I'm working with, for that person, when's going to be the best moment to listen to this for the first time.
Right.
And sometimes it's often like throw your earbuds in, like I want this to be like maybe a before part of your bedtime ritual, and
Nice.
just laying down, low lights, softness,
Yeah,
kindness,
absolutely.
all those warm, cozy things, and have a listen. And then your voice filters in and you walk people through that rain meditation. And I think it can be really hard for people the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe not
Absolutely.
even get through it. It's just like what, 10 minutes, 15-minute
Yeah,
recording.
yeah, I think it's 10 to
Not
15.
super
Yes.
long, yeah. Um, and it can be really hard. And I think when you're just driving and constantly going, and that, that being propelled forward, that ADHD piece, that
Yeah,
constant internalized hyperactivity, it's hard to slow down and be with yourself.
absolutely.
And so that's a cool exercise. I think that seems pretty simple, because then we take it up and examine kind of the things that came up for people while they were listening to it.
Yeah, yeah, and to be able to ask them like, what did that feel like, right? What did that feel like in your body when you
Mhm.
did that? And that might help them recognize, yeah, but maybe this is important, right? Maybe this is something that I can tap into a little bit more
Mhm.
frequently. Um, I often refer clients that I work with, or people that I speak to that are interested in learning about self-compassion, to Kristen Knapp's website. So
Mhm.
it's selfcompassion.org.
Mhm.
She has several exercises and several of her own meditations on there that can be helpful. Something I often use in my practice, along with like helping clients to turn towards themselves, um, is to say, what would you say to a friend? Right? That's often a way that can be really helpful in the awareness that they're not being compassionate to themselves.
Mhm.
Right? So being able to, so if they're struggling with something and
Yeah.
then they're hard on themselves about it, so let's say it's perfectionism, right? Oh my gosh, I can't believe that I got a C on that test.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things that happen, being able to, and you recognize they're being so hard on themselves, or saying such harsh things to themselves, and
Yeah.
the things they say out loud are probably not, as they're a little bit filtered, right? So the inner dialogue is important to pay attention to, right? And if
Bringing awareness to that.
what's that?
Bringing awareness to that even.
Bringing awareness to that. I mean, that's a big component of self-compassion too, is the mindful awareness.
Mhm.
But then being able to even simply ask the question, like, well, what would you say to a friend if they came to you with
Yeah.
this, if they were being so harsh towards themselves for getting a C on a test, right?
Yeah.
And they're right away able to say, oh my gosh, like I totally say, you'll it's okay, I've been there, right? Your heart goes out to them, you're able to help them recognize that it's not the end of the world, right? um,
Mhm.
that's a helpful tool that I often use.
Yeah. You're
Mhm.
making me think like also too of like really like boundary work, in the sense that some people apply those standards only to themselves, and
Yep,
they beat
totally.
themselves up inside, and it's never voice. It's this internal secret dialogue that goes on, and
Mhm.
they don't necessarily share that with other people. And the idea of saying the same things to someone else kind of horrifies them. And
Yeah.
then kind of at the other end of the continuum are sometimes people who not only say those things to themselves, but they also think everyone else should be meeting that standard.
Mhm.
And both can be really damaging to your relationships,
Mhm.
because on the one end, you're too rigid, maybe with boundaries. And on the
Mhm.
other hand, maybe we're being too porous with boundaries.
Mhm.
And there's just this no sense of where I end and everyone else begins.
Right, right. Yeah, that's often goes hand in hand with people who show up in my office that, put this pressure on themselves to be perfect. The boundaries are really difficult, right? Because they're always worried about what the other person is thinking. And
Yeah.
so for sure, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I heard this great thing. Well, I read it, I guess, on Instagram years ago. Like I want to say like 5 years ago, from a therapist that is out in California. And oh, I'm blanking on her name right now. I think her last name is Sky. Tay Sky. I will
Okay.
look it up and I'll reference it. But she's the first person who wrote, "Emotions are data, not directives."
Mm,
And that informs so much of how I started to understand, like, just because we feel something, just because we're afraid someone's going to judge us or be disappointed in us
right.
or have some opinion or feeling about their perception about whether or not we've missed the mark,
Right.
that's interesting information. It's data. That doesn't
Mhm,
necessarily mean we need to do something about it.
mhm,
Or
mhm.
honoring that place where we end and someone else begins. So someone can be upset with me or disappointed in me, and I can take that into consideration, think about it, reflect on it, and decide whether I want that to influence what I do moving forward.
Right.
It doesn't immediately mean that because they're disappointed, boom, I must go fix that in
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. I think
Not
that's
everyone
important.
else's susu, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, um, I think the fear is important to pay attention to, right? It's
Mhm.
it's it's an emotion. It's there to tell you something,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know if I yeah, I said I totally agreed, but in a nuanced way, I
Yep.
do, right? Because I think the fear is there and I think it's important. That's information too, right?
Yep.
It's coming from somewhere. Maybe we need to look at that closer, recognize where we feel that inside to hone in on
Yep.
maybe it's not fear, right? Maybe it's
Something
something
else.
different, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just because 'cause we're afraid, like, we still have to do we're afraid because like, it matches a pattern of something that
Right,
rightfully made us afraid at one point.
right,
If it
right,
comes in 5 years later,
right.
it's the same pattern showing up of behavior in other people will trigger the same fear response completely.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
It
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I
but
love that.
but do I actually need to be afraid? Because sometimes, like, I think we worry a lot about, like, do I need to, like, uncover the inciting incident in my childhood that started this? And I'm like, "Well, maybe we'll get there, but we
Mhm,
don't need to get hung up on that yet." Because I think actually the most important part is recognizing the pattern,
mhm.
right? So
Yeah,
we can have a working hypothesis maybe. Like, I like to do this sometimes with people, like, "Let's just chew on this one for a bit." Like, so
yeah,
say this is our hypothesis. Say, this fear of that comes up when this kind of thing happens in your life matches a pattern of, like, this thing
mhm,
that happened when we were 8 in grade 3,
mhm,
3rd grade, and it's just enough to know that our nervous system, our prehistoric, like, my little cave woman's like, "Oh, ding, 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 pattern recognition, whoop, ignite
mhm,
the response."
mhm,
Dialing into
mhm.
fight, not flight.
Yeah,
So what that looks like is irritation and anger and being short and kind of, like, ready to move, like, "All
yeah,
right, what are we gonna
yeah,
do? What's my next move?" Right?
yeah.
And then what I've learned over time and, through the work that I do and working with people is, like, that's my signal. When that energy comes up in my nervous system,
Yes.
sometimes it can be good and exciting, like I'm at the top of a ski hill
Yep, yep.
about to go down, and as someone who only learned how to ski 2 years ago, like, that's quite an adrenaline rush for me.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, but getting to that place where I'm kind of like, "Oh, I'm feeling that feeling." So that
Yeah,
feeling is my signal to be like, "Oh, do I actually need to be afraid right now?
right, right. Yes, yes, absolutely. You're speaking my
Maybe,
language.
but
This is
maybe
like
not."
yeah, absolutely how I work with people too, and that's why the somatic is so important, right? To recognize, okay, what's going on inside of me, right? And when does this show up, right? And being
Somatic meaning, like, just your body, like, your physical sensations.
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely, yes,
yeah.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
so fascinating. The thing that I love about the involving your body and the body work, when we kind of get out of the cognitive a little bit, like our
Mhm.
thinking, our higher thinking brain, is
Yeah.
that, like, it doesn't matter your sex, your gender, your culture, your
Mhm.
religion, the
Mhm.
color of your skin, what country you live in, your
Absolutely.
socioeconomic status. We
Yeah.
all have the same operating system on the inside.
Yes. It's the common humanity, right?
Common humanity, the way our nervous system operates, the way
Yeah.
the human body, the way us as mammals just continue to keep on keeping on, that survival drive that's programmed into our DNA. And so kind of when we understand that there's like a biological rationality to all the weird and quirky and kooky things that we do, then it becomes, I think that helps remove stigma too.
Absolutely it does, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love that. That
Yeah.
makes
When you
sense.
talked about that compassion that we feel for people, who feel so like weighed down by what's going on with them.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, it makes sense that you're experiencing this because look at all this stuff that you just said happened in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You're just having a mammal's biological response
Yeah.
to something bananas.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
how do we make life less bananas for you right now? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And my mammal nervous system would have done the same thing, which is why I get it.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And I think when you ask that question, what would you say to a friend, right? That taps into your compassion for others and shows you that you have, the capacity to do that for yourself too. And that opens up that common humanity, right? Which is an important component of self-compassion, right?
Yeah.
So self-compassion in Kristen Neff's research is to, be mindful, have the awareness that you're not being compassionate to self, perhaps, right? And noticing like the self-critical voice that might be there.
Yeah.
And also recognizing, you're not alone in it, right? We
Yes.
all experience suffering, right? And so being able to
Sure.
be mindful of that when you're being self-critical, right, is helpful. And then turning to, what would you say to a friend? Maybe I can start to say some of those things to myself as well. So
Yeah.
that in combination with the felt sense and the
Yeah.
being able to, turn towards the protectiveness that you once needed
Right.
is something that, I don't know, that's kind of packaging it up for me. That's
Yeah.
a way of, yeah.
And like, I think the other thing I hear you saying is it's so important to do this in connection to other people,
Yeah.
in community, and recognizing our interdependence. So that piece that, our nervous systems, we can soothe ourselves, but it'll always prefer receiving soothing with somebody else and
We're
with
wired for connection.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
safety in numbers. It's like, like 200 million years ago when the cave people went out to hunt, they did it in groups and packs. And there's safety in numbers, and so
Absolutely.
that programming still very much alive in our DNA today. Just that's it. That's what we're here to do, is to support each other and be together. And when we feel that sense of shame, we become isolated.
That's right.
No wonder it's depressing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when we can start to share some of the feelings of shame, which often happens in therapy, which, could be the first time someone's sharing something they feel shame around, when you undo that aloneness with them, right? That shame starts to, dissipate. And that's when you can get underneath the defenses and help.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I kind of have like two questions left for you. So one is like, is there an objective way to say I'm an adult who's coming and I'm starting to unpack and work on this stuff for the first time? How long is it going to take?
Oh, which is a common thing for someone that experiences perfectionism.
Yeah, I think inquiring minds want to know.
Right. You want me to answer that?
Yeah. What do you think?
How long is it going to take?
I mean,
individual. Yeah. How would I answer? Yeah, I would say, oh my gosh, that's, let's slow down a little bit, right? And let's just focus on right here and right now and today. And we'll see where we can go from there. I don't work in a manualized way. So it's very individual, and I want them to feel like I'm here for them, and to I think people do come in with that sometimes, but they let go of it, right? Once they recognize, okay, what therapy is, and not so much about, going through the steps, right? It's not about that. Everybody has a different journey, and their journey in therapy is going to be different too.
Right. And I think as we go through different stages of life and we have different experiences in our life, we come to new understandings about ourselves, and then this information means something different as we step along the way. So the goal evolves as we evolve. I think kind of maybe also.
Often people come in when they're in crisis, right?
Yeah.
And often the really important work is done once we've kind of
resolve the crisis a little bit.
Resolve the crisis. We're able to put the crisis maybe over here a little bit, and then we recognize the patterns, like you said earlier, right? And where some of that comes from, and dig a little bit deeper.
dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So then the last kind of question that I would like to ask you, maybe like a personal reflection for yourself, like as as an adult, as becoming a therapist and working with people, being a woman in the world,
Mhm.
um, how has the journey, I guess, to be more self-compassionate or to combat perfectionism, like how has that been for you? And are there things you would tell your younger self maybe
Yeah,
about that?
yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. I definitely do identify as a recovering perfectionist, I would say. Um, it's a work in progress for sure. It's interesting because when I was introduced to self-compassion, I was in my practicum and
Mhm.
struggling, right? Struggling myself with the perfectionism, for the first time being in front of, a client, how scary, that there's almost nothing scarier, right?
Yeah.
So self-compassion, just the research that I was taking in was really helpful for me at the time. It was something that my supervisor recommended that, I might want to do a little bit of research in, but I grabbed onto it, I think, because it just really resonated with me
Yeah,
as something
makes
that
so
I
much
don't
sense.
do for myself.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, just to talk a little bit about my journey, I think when I did some specific therapy with an AEDP therapist,
Mhm.
that's when I was able to deepen my connection to myself and be more self-compassionate. Um, just like I was saying earlier, being able to, and you said it too, like being able to relate to my younger self, right? Because
Yeah.
this is a little bit of like, yeah, certainly for me anyways, my perfectionism came from some experiences that I had when I was younger,
Mhm.
and to be able to recognize that and turn towards that with compassion, right? So
Yeah.
having that's when I was able to really embrace it further, right? So I had the theory, I had the awareness of what the components of self-compassion are, but wasn't really able to deepen it for myself until I did some important inner work.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that because I think it's going to be really nice for other people to hear that, right? What it was like for you type of piece, and I think there is that piece of sometimes you're ready when you're ready, and it can be hard to force that process,
Hmm.
and it can be. I say sometimes as a late diagnosed ADHD, or I don't know if anyone tried to point this out to me in my 20s, if that would have gone well.
Hmm. Sure.
I just
Sure.
wasn't in a place where I was interested
Hmm.
in that kind of feedback or in examining things at that level. I mean, or would I have been? I don't know. I
Right.
mean, you
Right.
can't really go back and rewrite history. It was what it was. And I'm really glad that I figured it out when I did. Because
No, I think you make a really good point,
yeah,
right? Yeah, absolutely.
because we can beat ourselves up a lot saying like, "Oh my gosh, I should have figured this out. I should have," like that
Uh-huh.
we're shitting all
Uh-huh.
over ourselves like all the
Mhm.
time, which I don't know if that's falls more in the perfectionistic camp or just being
And
a
that can be work that
woman
you
in
do
the
in
world.
therapy too, right? That's mourning the self, right? Mourning what you didn't have, what you know now that you could
Uh,
have, doing some work with that is some work that I've had to do for sure.
yeah.
And work that I do with my clients as well. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah. This
Yeah.
was fun.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything else like we should mention about it that we haven't really kind of touched on? Because I think we covered a lot, but
I think so. Like I just in terms of like resources, I did mention that
yep,
selfcompassion.org. Maybe you can include that in your
yep,
show notes. There's
I
some
will.
good little exercises that she recommends in there. Brene Brown's work too. She has a really nice book called The Gifts of Imperfection, where she looks at the different guideposts of being a wholehearted
Yeah.
person. That one's a
There's
really
there's
helpful.
worksheets that you can download for free from her website that go with that book.
Yeah, there is, and actually
I'll try to link to that.
both Brene and Kristen Neff have some assessments, self-assessments.
Okay.
So Brené's is on identifying where you fall in those guideposts. So looking at each of the different components of what makes a wholehearted person, which is very connected to perfectionism, and then or not being kind of that recovery of perfectionism. And then Kristen Neff has an assessment that looks at the different areas of self-compassion that I mentioned. So the mindfulness, the self-kindness, and the common humanity, and where you show up on those kind of like spectrums. So those are things that people can check out too.
Cool. I will make sure that I link all those things. I'm also going to relink Mindy's self-compassion meditation because it's lovely.
Thank
If you
you.
want to give that a go
Thank
in
you.
the show notes. And thank you so much. I really value your time. I appreciate you coming and doing this and guinea pigging this with me.
No problem. I
Sharing
enjoyed
your
it. Thanks so much
experience.
for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it.
Okay.
Okay, let me stop recording.